The request came before the last chord had finished ringing, so quietly that only 3 people in the drawing room understood at once that it would undo them. Edith Farrow, kneeling at the pianoforte's side to gather the fallen sheet that had slipped from the stand in the final measure, heard it as she heard most things that concerned her, sideways, as if it had been meant for someone else. She did not yet know what the Duke of Merrow's 4 words would cost her before the month was out. Had she known, she would have knelt there just the same, because the page had been in danger of tearing, and some habits run deeper than fear. Selina rose from the harp in a swan's unhurried grace, already composing her face for the compliment she had been promised her whole life would come to her in rooms like this one. Marguerite, at the pianoforte, was still flushed from the triumph of having finished the difficult passage at all. It was Mrs. Farrow who answered first, because Mrs. Farrow always answered first. "Your Grace does us great honor," she said, already steering him with her eyes toward Selina, who is, I may say, considered the finest harpist in the county, though I am her mother and must not be believed. The Duke of Merrow did not look at Selina. He was a tall, grave man with the stillness of someone who had learned early that a room quiets faster for silence than for noise, and he had watched the whole performance from the same chair without once glancing at his own hands, which was, Edith would later understand, unusual in him. He said again, patiently, as though repeating a fact rather than a request, that he wished to know the name of the young lady who had turned the pages. There was a small silence of the kind that changes the temperature of a room. Marguerite laughed once, delighted, assuming a joke. Selina's smile held admirably, though something behind it went still as water going to ice. Edith Farrow, 26, in a gray wool gone through its second turning, straightened from the floor with the retrieved sheet in her hand and did what she had done at every recital of her life. She made herself small, made herself furniture, made herself the sort of fixture a great house keeps and does not introduce. It did not work. "My cousin, Mrs. Farrow said, in the voice of a woman rearranging a room that has just been overturned. "Edith, she keeps the music in order for the girls." The Duke inclined his head, unhurried, as if he had all the patience in the world and meant to spend some of it here. "Then, it is Miss Farrow I should like to meet," he said, "and I should like to ask her something about the second movement, if she will permit it." Peg, who had been standing by the door with the tea things and no apparent interest in music at all, made a small sound into her sleeve that might have been a cough. Edith would remember, afterward, that she had counted the days in her head before she had even decided to be afraid. 17 days until Selina's birthday, until the solicitor came, until the ledgers were opened for the first time since their father died, until whatever was wrong with the numbers her father had taught her to read would have nowhere left to hide. 17 days had seemed, an hour ago, like a great deal of time. It did not feel like a great deal of time now, with the Duke's gray eyes resting on her as though she were a sum he intended to check. She crossed the room because there was no other direction to go in, and because she had learned from her father, before anything else he had taught her, that the wrong note is best met by playing on. "Your Grace," she said, and dropped the small, correct curtsy of a poor relation who knows exactly how much space she is permitted. He did not return the courtesy with the idle warmth great men use on women they do not intend to remember. He looked at her the way, she thought, a man looks at a ledger column that will not balance and interests him more for its stubbornness. "In the second movement," he said, "there was a note struck that should not have belonged to the piece. I heard it corrected before it could be heard as a mistake. I have been trying, for the better part of an hour, to work out how a page-turner does that without once touching the keys." Selina, from the harp, said quickly that Marguerite had a wonderful ear, everyone said so, and had studied under Signor Bellini's own pupil in town. The Duke did not look away from Edith. "I did not ask for a performance," he said. "I asked for the truth of the page." It was the first time in her life anyone of consequence had asked Edith Farrow for the truth of anything, and she felt the 17 days close a little around her, like a hand. She answered him plainly, because plainness had always been safer than charm, which she had never been permitted to practice. "The printed copy has a wrong note in the 9th bar," she said. "My father copied it out years ago for my own hand, and never troubled to correct the engraver's error, because he said a piece is not the paper it is written on, only the sound it is meant to make. I have heard it played correctly since I was a child. I turn the page in time to remind whichever of my cousins is playing which note the composer actually intended." Selina, at the harp, had gone the particular white of a woman recalculating an entire evening. Marguerite, more honestly, only looked delighted to have been, in some oblique way, praised. The Duke considered this with the seriousness of a man weighing coin. "Your father," he said, "was a musician." "He kept the books for a great house," Edith said, "and taught himself the pianoforte on winter evenings, because he said a man who understands proportion in one thing generally understands it in another. He has been dead 4 years, Your Grace." "I am sorry for it," the Duke said, and did not say it the way people say such things at recitals, as furniture for conversation. He said it the way a man states a fact he intends to remember. Then, unexpectedly, he asked whether she played herself. Mrs. Farrow, recovering her composure with visible effort, answered for her. She has not the time for it, being so occupied about the house, and ushered the subject firmly back toward Selina's forthcoming performance at the Assembly Rooms, and toward the birthday that would fall in 17 days, at which, she noted brightly, the whole county would be gathered, and at which her eldest daughter would come into her inheritance and, she did not say, but everyone in the room understood her to mean, into her full eligibility. Peg set down the tea tray with more force than tea trays generally require. Later, when the carriages had gone and the candles were being drawn down one by one, Peg found Edith in the cold music room straightening the sheets by the window, and said, without preamble, that she had known men to fall in love over less than a corrected 9th bar, and that Edith had better decide now whether she meant to let it happen to her or whether she meant to go on being furniture until she was buried as such. Edith said that no one looks twice at the one turning pages, and that this had always suited her very well. Peg only sniffed and said that dukes, in her experience, looked exactly where they were not expected to, which was generally the trouble with them. The 17 days did not pass gently. They pressed, from the very next morning, on every ordinary hour of the house, because Mr. Pemberton the solicitor, a small dry man with ink permanently at the second knuckle of his right hand, sent word that he would attend at Belcombe on the morning after Selina's birthday to close the trust her father had left in Mr. Thorne's keeping and pass its management, at last, into Selina's own. It ought to have been the happiest of prospects. Edith had spent 3 winters now bent over the account books at odd hours, ostensibly practicing her father's old habit of tallying the household expenses for her mother's peace of mind, and had found, in that time, a series of small figures that would not resolve. A rent paid twice in one column and once in another, an annuity from the old Duke's estate that arrived each quarter a little thinner than the year before, a note in her father's own hand tucked once behind a flyleaf that read only, in his neat steward's script, "Ask J.T." for the difference, and no answer beneath it that she had ever found. She had said nothing of this to her mother, who would only wring her hands, nor to Selina, who would only wring hers louder before an audience. She had gone, instead, twice now, to Mr. Josiah Thorne himself, the family's trustee and her father's old friend, a smooth, fastidious man who smelled always of orris powder and adjusted the pin at his cravat when he spoke of money, and each time he had smiled at her with the particular gentleness reserved for children. Trust accounts are a dry business not fit for a young lady's evenings, my dear, he had told her. Numbers do not lie, only people. You would do better to leave the ledger to me and your music to your cousins. She had not believed him either time. She had also, both times, said nothing further, because to accuse a man who had managed the family's only income for 4 years, on the word of an unfinished note behind a flyleaf, was to risk destroying the very roof over her mother's head before she had proof enough to replace it. Edith did not know, that first night, that the Duke of Marrow's interest in a corrected 9th bar had anything at all to do with any of this. She knew only that a great man had looked at her as though she were a person, that her mother was already composing letters about it to 3 separate aunts, and that somewhere in the house a note her father had left unresolved 4 years ago was still waiting, patiently, the way an unplayed chord waits to be struck. He called at Belcombe 8 days later and did not trouble to disguise that it was Edith he had come for, a fact that undid 3 weeks of her mother's careful campaigning in a single afternoon. He found her in the small morning room, mending the torn corner of the very sheet music that had begun the trouble, and he stood in the doorway a moment before she saw him, in the particular stillness of a man who has decided to be honest rather than clever. I have come to strike a bargain with you, Miss Farrow, if you will hear it. She set down her needle. That depends a good deal on the terms, Your Grace. Good, he said. I dislike bargaining with people who accept terms unheard. It tells me nothing about them. I should like your judgment on a matter of accounts. My own steward has died these 6 months, and I have found, since, a quantity of figures in his ledgers that trouble me and no one else. You have, I am told, an unusual eye for a page that does not resolve as it ought. I will pay for your time as I would pay any man of business, and I will ask nothing further of you than your honesty. She studied him for the falseness she had learned, from Thorn, to expect in any gentleman's offer, and found, to her own surprise, none. Why me, she asked, when the county has solicitors enough. Because a solicitor tells me what the numbers permit, he said. I begin to suspect you would tell me what they mean. There was a silence in which the clock did a great deal of work. I cannot accept payment, Your Grace, she said at last. My mother would ask where it came from, and I have not yet decided how much of my own house's business I am free to explain to anyone, even you. It was as near as she had ever come, with anyone outside her own walls, to admitting that Belcombe's accounts were not what they seemed, and she watched him receive it without pressing her further, which she had not expected either. Then we will call it a favor between 2 people who read the same 9th bar the same way, he said, and something in his face, grave as it habitually was, eased by 1 full degree. Peg, informed of the visit over the mending basket that evening, said only that she had known it, and asked whether Edith meant to tell him about the flyleaf. Not yet, Edith said. There is a thing I am not free to lay before him. Not yet, she repeated, as if saying it twice might make it truer, and Peg, who had raised her from a child and knew the exact weight a silence like that one carried, did not ask again. Word of the Duke's visits, for they became, within a fortnight, regular enough to have a name in the village, though no one dared say it to Mrs. Farrow's face, traveled faster than Belcombe's own post. It reached Josiah Thorne on a Tuesday, delivered by Miss Verity Cole, who called ostensibly to admire Selina's new bonnet and remained to observe, with the cool, assessing eye of a young woman who had set her own cap at a duke and did not care to lose the county to a page-turner in grey wool. He is seen at Belcombe above once a week now, Miss Cole said, over tea she did not want, and always closeted with the plain cousin, if you can credit it, over papers. Thorne, who had come that same afternoon on trust business, set down his cup with a care that did not entirely disguise the tightening of his hand upon it. "Miss Farrow has always had a fondness for paper," he said lightly. "Her father's daughter in that, if in nothing more fortunate." He found Edith alone in the music room an hour later and complimented her, with his particular gentle smoothness, on having caught the interest of so great a man, though he trusted, he said, that a young woman of her sense would not let a duke's passing curiosity turn her head toward matters that did not concern her. "You have your father's eye for numbers, my dear," he said, adjusting the pin at his cravat as he always did when the subject of numbers arose. "A pity it does no one any good, tucked away here in the schoolroom. Going over sums no one asked you to check." "I was not aware anyone had forbidden it," Edith said. "No one need forbid what does no harm," Thorne said, smiling, and left her with the particular chill of a threat delivered so gently it might, an hour later, be mistaken for kindness. That same week, the first small forensic thread presented itself, though Edith did not yet know to pull it. Going over the quarter's accounts at her mother's request, she found among the receipts a note in Thorne's own careful hand, authorizing a payment to a land agent in town for repairs to a cottage roof that she happened to know, from Peg, had never been repaired at all. The roof having leaked clean through the previous winter onto old Mrs. Agate's bed, she copied the figure into the back of her own commonplace book without comment, filed it beside her father's unfinished note, and said nothing to anyone but Peg, who only pursed her lips and said that she had always thought Josiah Thorne's cuffs a great deal finer than a country solicitor's fees could account for. It was over the account books themselves, 3 days later, that the Duke and Edith came nearest to something neither of them had yet named. He had brought his own steward's ledgers to Belcombe, rather than have her come to Rwandan unchaperoned, and they sat at either end of the long table in the morning room, with the November light going gold and thin across the paper, and for the better part of 2 hours worked in the particular companionable silence of two people who trust the same figures. "I have found the error," she said finally, turning the ledger to face him. "Here, a rent recorded as paid in October that was never entered as received in September. Someone has moved the same sum forward twice to disguise a shortfall further down the page." He looked at it a long moment. "My father trusted this man's father before him," he said. "I have been slow to think ill of the son." "Thinking well of people too long is not a fault," she said. "It is only a debt that comes due eventually, like any other." He looked up at that, and something passed between them that was not quite a smile and was warmer than one. "You speak as though you have paid that debt yourself," he said. "I am paying it now," she said, and stopped, because she had gone further than she meant to. "There is a thing in my own house I cannot yet lay before you," she said. "I am not free of it." He did not press her, though she watched him want to. "Then I will wait until you are," he said, and it was the first time in her life a man had offered her patience instead of persuasion, and she found she did not know what to do with the warmth that came of it, except to bend her head back over the ledger and pretend the columns needed her full attention. Later, when the tea had gone cold and neither of them had rung for more, he told her. In the plain, unhurried way he told most things, that he had once had a brother, younger by 4 years, killed in the peninsula, and that he had not laughed at anything without first feeling the old guilt of it for the better part of a year afterward, until an afternoon in this very room, over a column of figures that would not balance, he had laughed outright at some dry remark of hers about solicitors and their cuffs, and had felt, for the first time since the news came, that laughing did not dishonor the dead. She did not know what to say to a gift given so plainly, and so she said only that grief was itself a kind of ledger, and that he owed himself, eventually, the right to close the account without shame, and he looked at her as though she had struck the true note in a bar that had troubled him for a year. The blow, when it came from the very gift that had brought her that far. Thorne called at Belcombe on the morning of the ball's dress rehearsal with a face arranged into sorrow, so exact that Edith knew, before he had spoken a word, that whatever followed would be a performance rather than a confession. He asked for Mrs. Farrow privately, and it was Selina, hovering at the door out of pure nerves for her birthday to come, who overheard enough of it to carry the substance to Edith White, faced within the hour. He says, Selina told her, that sums have been found altered in Papa's old trust book, in a hand he cannot swear to but fears he recognizes, and that you, Edith, have been over those very books alone. At odd hours, these 3 years, and closeted besides with the Duke over figures no one asked you to touch. Edith felt the ground of the last month go out from beneath her all at once. It is not my hand, she said. It is his. I found the very entry. I copied it. She stopped, because Selina's face held more fear than belief, and because she understood, in the same instant. The whole shape of what Thorne had built, her own competence, the very gift her father had given her, turned end for end and pointed back at her throat. He has always disliked being questioned, Edith said slowly, and now he need not answer the question at all. He need only answer for me. Mrs. Farrow, summoned, wept without deciding what to believe, which was its own kind of verdict. It fell to Thorne, gentle as ever, to propose the remedy, that Miss Farrow be quietly removed from the household before the birthday, before Mr. Pemberton's audit, before any scandal could touch Selina on the very threshold of her inheritance. A private arrangement, he said. A small settlement paid from his own pocket out of old affection for her father, so long as she would sign a paper acknowledging her error and trouble the family no further, and say nothing to the Duke of any of it. It was, Edith understood, a bribe dressed as mercy, and it would have bought her a small independence and her silence both. She thought of the flyleaf, of the cottage roof, of her father's 4-year-old hand asking for a difference never given. I will not sign what is not true, she said, however dearly it is bought. Then you will be dismissed as a thief unproven, Thorne said gently, which is very often worse than being dismissed as one proven, and left her to consider it, adjusting his cravat pin as he went, as if the matter had already been settled to everyone's satisfaction but hers. She was gone from Belcombe within 2 days, sent to Peg's widowed sister in the next parish under the thin cover of a visit, while Mrs. Farrow, weeping and unwilling to choose between 2 daughters, one born to her, one merely raised, allowed Thorne to manage the shameful business as he saw fit before the birthday could be spoiled by it. Edith sat in a low, borrowed room with her father's rosewood writing box on her knee, the one thing she had taken with her, and turned it over without opening it, because she had never yet found the courage to try the small stiff drawer at its base that did not, by its dimensions, account for the whole depth of the box. She thought of the Duke, who did not yet know she was gone, who would call at Belcombe and be told some smooth thing by Thorne, and believe, perhaps, that she had simply tired of the acquaintance, or worse, that the whisper of dishonesty was true. No one looks twice at the one turning pages, she thought, and found, for the first time, that the thought brought no comfort at all. Only the old ache of having made herself so carefully small that her own disappearance left no shape behind it. It was Peg who broke the stillness, arriving on the second evening with her knitting and her sister's cold mutton, and no patience whatsoever for despair. I did not raise you to sit in a borrowed chair and be erased, Peg said. Your father gave you that box the week before he died, and told me himself there is more in it than letters, though he never said what, only that you were to have it when you needed it and not one day before. Try the drawer, girl. Edith's hands were not steady. The false bottom, once found, gave with a small dry sound like a held breath let go, and beneath it lay a single folded sheet in her father's own hand, a fair copy of the true trust accounts as they had stood the year he died, every figure whole and unaltered. And beneath that, a letter in a different, older hand, the old Duke of Marrow's own, thanking Edmund Farrow by name for a service that letter did not specify, but plainly praised. And setting down, in his own words, the exact terms of the annuity that Thorne had spent 4 years quietly thinning. There was a third thing besides, small and cold in her palm, a tuning fork, engraved with her father's initials, the very one he had used to teach her the note a piano ought to make before he ever taught her the note it did. She sat a long while with all 3 in her lap before she understood what her father had left her was not comfort. It was evidence, and she had, at last, 17 hours left before the birthday to decide what a poor, dismissed, unproven woman might do with it. She did not go to the Duke first, though every instinct of the heart urged her to. She went, instead, before dawn, to Mr. Pemberton, because she had learned by then that testimony persuades no one but objects standing in the light persuade everyone, and a dry little solicitor with ink at his knuckle was the one man in the county whose good opinion could not be bought with a smile. He read the fair copy twice, held the old Duke's letter to the window to be certain of the seal, and said at the end of it, in the flattest voice she had ever heard him use, that this changed a great deal, and that it would be best done properly, before witnesses, at the very hour the trust was due to be closed, so that no one afterward could say the thing had been settled in a corner. It was Peg who thought to send word to Rwandan, on her own authority and without asking leave of anyone, because, as she said afterward, a man who has been closeted over figures with a woman for 2 months has earned the right to be present when those figures speak. The Duke arrived at Belcombe an hour before the birthday guests, found Edith in the cold morning room with her father's box open on the table, and said nothing at first but crossed the room and took her hand once, briefly, as a man confirms a thing is real before he trusts himself to speak of it. "You were gone," he said. "I was accused," she said, "of the very thing I had been trying, these 3 years, to undo, and I could not clear myself without proof I did not yet know I owned." "Show me," he said, and she did, and watched his grave face go graver still as he read the old Duke's own hand, his own father's hand, thanking a steward whose daughter had just been called a thief for guarding his memory. "My clerk is due, within the hour," said Mr. Pemberton, arriving with his papers and his flattest voice, "to close the account before your sister and myself, Miss Farrow, exactly as your father's will required. I propose we let him arrive on schedule and let the account close in full daylight before every soul your mother has invited to celebrate it." Selina, summoned and told only that something concerning her birthday required her presence in the morning room a half-hour before the guests, went white, and then, unexpectedly, still, "If it clears your name," she told Edith, "I would rather have the truth at my birthday than a fortune I cannot trust the sum of." It was, Edith thought, the kindest thing her cousin had ever said to her, and the most costly, since it meant giving up, before it was even opened, the comfortable fiction that the inheritance had ever been safe. They gathered at noon in the long drawing room where the recital had been held 2 months before, the same chairs arranged in nearly the same order. Mr. Pemberton at the small table with his papers. Mrs. Farrow wringing her hands into a fresh handkerchief, Selina pale and upright at the harp she was not asked to play, Marguerite wide-eyed by the window. Miss Verity Cole arrived early for the birthday, and now watching with the sharp, assessing interest of a woman who senses that the county's whole understanding of itself is about to be rearranged. Thorne came in smiling, unaware, and took the chair nearest the fire as though it were owed him. Mr. Pemberton opened the proceedings with the dry formality of a man reading a will, stating that before the trust could pass to Miss Selina Farrow, certain discrepancies had come to light, which must be resolved in the sight of all parties named in her father's original settlement. He laid the fair copy on the table, and beside it the current ledger, page by page, and asked Mr. Thorne to account for the difference between them. Thorne's smile did not move, though his hand went, as it always did, to the pin at his cravat. "Copying errors," he said easily. "A dead man's arithmetic against a living man's, and dead men do not defend their sums." "Then let a living one defend them," said Mr. Pemberton, and called in the family's own under clerk, young Corbin, who had for 2 years copied Thorne's entries at his dictation, and who now stood in the doorway with the particular gray unhappiness of a man who has been quietly afraid for a long time and is about to stop. "Mr. Corbin," Pemberton said, not unkindly, whose hand entered the September rent as unpaid in this ledger, when the receipt in my own possession, given me by Miss Farrow, shows it paid and signed for. Corbin looked at Thorne, and Thorne looked back at him with an expression Edith had seen him wear only once before, over the matter of the cottage roof, and it was that look, more than any question, that broke the younger man. "I entered what I was told to enter, sir," Corbin said, his voice unsteady but carrying. "Mr. Thorne dictated the figures to me himself each quarter, and told me the old book need not trouble anyone so long as the new one balanced. I did not ask why, sir. I needed my place. I am sorry for it now." Thorne came, at last, off the smoothness that had carried him 4 years, and Edith watched a man's composure fail in real time, which she had not expected to find as sorrowful as it was. He did not shout, nor deny it further, which was somehow worse than either. He said only, after a long silence in which the fire was the loudest thing in the room, that Edmund Farrow had been given an annuity and a good name for service Thorne's own father had performed twice over and been thanked for, with nothing at all. That he had watched, his whole life, lesser men rewarded for less. And that when the chance had come to take back, in small quarterly sums, what he considered simple justice, he had told himself it was owed him, and had gone on telling himself so, until he no longer knew whether he believed it. He looked, for one unguarded moment, adjusting the pin at his cravat, with a hand that was not steady, like a man mourning a father who had never once been proud of him, and Edith, watching, felt the anger she had carried against him for 3 years thin, without vanishing, into something closer to pity. Mr. Pemberton asked, formally, whether he wished to answer for the theft before a magistrate. It was the Duke who spoke before Thorne could. "There has been enough public ruin in this room for one birthday," he said. "I would rather see the sum repaid and the man gone quietly than see a family's name dragged through an assize for the sake of satisfaction. Let him render a full account to Mr. Pemberton, surrender what remains, and remove himself abroad on whatever small allowance is left to him once the debt is settled, and let that be the whole of it. It is not kindness to him," he added, meeting Edith's eyes once, briefly. "It is protection for everyone he might yet lie to if he stays." Thorne, given the choice between disgrace and quiet exile, took the quiet, and left the room a smaller man than he had entered it, pausing once at the door to say, to no one in particular, that Edmund Farrow's daughter had her father's eye after all, which might have been the nearest thing to an apology he had in him. Mr. Pemberton then did the thing Edith had least expected of that long, grim morning. He read aloud, for the whole room and for the record, the old Duke's letter naming Edmund Farrow a man of unimpeachable honesty, and declared that whatever whisper had ever touched her father's memory in this county was, by his own long research and by the evidence now in hand, entirely without foundation, and ought to be considered closed. Mrs. Farrow wept, this time without needing to choose whom to believe. Selina, at the harp, played nothing, but reached over and took Edith's hand in front of everyone, which was its own kind of music. Miss Verity Cole, who had come to watch a scandal, found instead a vindication, and had the grace unusual in her to say afterward that she had misjudged the plain cousin badly and would not do so again. A recantation Edith received with more warmth than she expected to feel for a rival. The Duke found her alone an hour later, out past the guests already gathering for what had become, against all early omens, a genuinely happy birthday, in the same cold morning room where her father's box still lay open on the table. He did not begin with love, which she was glad of, because she would not have trusted it yet after a morning like that one. He began, instead, with the ledger. "Your father's account is closed and clear," he said. "Your sister's inheritance is whole. Your own name owes an apology to no one, least of all yourself." She said that she had not known, until that morning, how much of her own worth she had let a dead man's unfinished note and a living man's smooth voice decide for her. "Then decide it yourself now," he said, and reached into his coat and drew out, of all things, the tuning fork from her father's box, which she had left with Mr. Pemberton as evidence, and which the Duke had apparently retrieved and kept about him the whole grim proceeding, waiting. He struck it once against the table's edge and held it up between them, and it rang the same true note her father had taught her before he taught her anything else. "I did not ask to meet you 2 months ago because I mistook you for one of your cousins," he said. "I asked because you corrected a wrong note without once claiming credit for having heard it, and I had not met, in a very long while, a person who would rather see a thing set right than be admired for setting it right. I am asking you now, with your fortune settled and your name clear, and nothing whatsoever that you need from me, whether you will marry me. Marry me because you wish it. It is the only reason I will take." She thought of 17 days that had once seemed an eternity, of a note her father left unresolved for 4 years, of a page-turner's whole education in being small, and she said that she wished it very much, and that she would tell him so again in church, before witnesses, since it seemed to be a habit of this family to prefer their truths spoken in the light. He laughed then, the same laugh he had first found in this very room over a column of figures, no longer guilty of it at all, and a wren in the hedge outside the window went on singing through the whole of it, entirely unconcerned with dukes or ledgers, or the small, enormous things human beings decide between one heartbeat and the next. The wedding, when it came in the new year, was a small, quiet business by the standards of a man who could have filled a cathedral, held in the parish church with frost still silvering the hedges, and Peg weeping without shame into a handkerchief she pretended was only for her cold, and Selina standing up as witness in a gown, a good deal plainer than the one she had worn to the recital that started it all, because, she said, some things ought not to compete with the bride. Marguerite married, within 2 years, a clergyman with a fine tenor voice and no head for figures whatsoever, and was, by all accounts, entirely content to leave the household books to him. Miss Verity Cole, freed at last from the exhausting business of competing for a duke she had never truly wanted so much as required, married a baronet's son with a genuine gift for laughing at himself, and was heard more than once to say that Edith Farrow had done her the great kindness of losing a race she had never wished to run. Young Corbin, having told the truth when it cost him most, was given a clerk's place at Rowandon itself under Mr. Pemberton's own supervision, and was, within the year, keeping the straightest ledgers in the county. Mr. Josiah Thorne lived out his remaining years on the continent on the small allowance settled upon him, and wrote once a single letter to Belcombe, which said only that he hoped Edmund Farrow's daughter had never doubted, whatever he had done, that her father had been the better man. Edith read it once, said nothing of it to anyone but Peg, and kept it, in the end, in the same rosewood box that had held everything else her father ever left her. Peg came to live at Rwandan in the fullness of time, ostensibly to oversee the nursery when it was needed, and ruled the housekeeper's room there with the same blunt tongue she had always used at Belcombe, informing anyone who would listen that she had known how it would end from the very first evening, when a duke had looked twice at the one turning pages. Nearly a year to the day after that first recital, Rwandan held an evening of music of its own, and it was the Duchess of Marrow who sat at the pianoforte this time, having been taught in secret for months by her husband's own patient insistence, while Selina, now mistress of her own modest independence and easier in her beauty than she had ever been while guarding it, stood ready to turn the pages, laughing at the reversal of it. Edith struck the 9th bar correctly, from memory, exactly as her father had taught her, and looked up once, mid-phrase, to find her husband watching her with the same stillness he had worn the very first time, though nothing about his face was grave now. The same wren, or its grandchild, sang on in the hedge outside the window, indifferent as ever to dukes and ledgers alike, and no one in the room that evening looked twice at anyone turning pages, because everyone, at last, was looking at her. If this story warmed you, if you have ever been the one standing just behind the light, keeping someone else's music in order and telling yourself that suited you fine, then come sit a while longer by this fire before you go. There is a chair kept for you here, a kettle always somewhere near the boil, and no hurry at all to leave. Tell me in the comments below which line you would have wanted handed back to you at the end, the way a duke once handed back a tuning fork. And if you would like another evening like this one, stay close to the hearth, subscribe, and keep your place among us for the next story. Until then, sleep well, and be gentle with the ones who have been quietly turning your pages all along.